So, as a publisher, an indie press, how would you say the market is and the general health of the reading community and the publishing industry as a whole in 2024? Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Or are we treading water?
I think those are two different things, actually. I think the reading community is stronger. More people seem to be able to connect, read, find their own niche, do whatever what they want to do to share that and experience the reading process. But for publishing, it's getting worse and worse because there's just so much content. Fewer and fewer things can break through. Everything that used to be middling is now low in terms of sales. I think that's become tricky. So you have great potential by being able to tap into great reading audiences. And then this is like extreme competition that's just exploding outwards in terms of self-published books and whatnot.
Yeah, I guess I didn't think about that. Welcome back to the Life on Books podcast. My name is Tony. With me, as always, is Andy, a.k.a. Metafictional Meathead. We are joined today by Chad Post, Director of Open Letter Publishing. They are a publisher associated with the University of Rochester that specializes and works in translation. Chad, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So it is Women in Translation Month. So we're going to be talking a lot about that in particular, obviously translated works, but we just touched on the state of the reading industry and the publishing industry. So what do you kind of forecast for both of those two groups over the next maybe 5 to 10 years?
Ooh, you want bold predictions? I'll give you bold predictions that might not come true.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, I think that there's going to be a sea change in terms of distribution. I think there's going to have to be. The margins that are existent within the largest distributors, especially for independent publishers, are just shrinking so much. It's so expensive. The kind of results aren't there. So I think there's going to be something that happens. I don't know what that is. It could be a new company. It could be a new way of formulating how printing and sales work. Or it could be just a change in how books reach the public. For example, let me give you a little bit of background on this that may make it more specific. So Ingram, our distributor, and I don't think I'm giving away any trade secrets here. If I am, they already hate me, so whatever. They really prefer, their dream as a distributor is that we as publishers put all of our books into Lightning Source on day one. So Lightning Source is a print-on-demand, small print run sort of model where they can print books very, very fast. The quality is not terrible. It's actually pretty good. It's pretty comparable, but it's a little bit different. There's fewer options in terms of paper supply, the cover material, things like that. But it's okay. But they'd like us to put our books in there right from the beginning, print a certain amount for the first print run so that the books that sales reps have already sold to the stores, all the pre-orders are fulfilled, and then never have excess inventory. Anytime a bookstore, an individual, whomever wants a copy of a book, they order it. Ingram prints a copy or 10 copies, whatever needs to be done. Those books get shipped out, inventory clean. Everything's just within this digital forever sort of service. That is interesting because inventory is one of the trickier parts of the publishing business. When you do, one of the great lines is your last print run is your most fucked print run. So you always print too many or too few. You're always short copies, or you're paying Ingram astronomical sums of money to house a book that you thought was going to sell a lot of copies. The traditional printing scheme takes 6 to 8 weeks to get books printed versus this Lightning Source is 2 weeks max. It's super fast. The scale is different. If you go to a traditional printer, you have to print 1,000 or more copies for them for the pricing to work. Otherwise, it's astronomically expensive. By converse, Lightning Source above 1,000 doesn't work super well, but we'll not leave that alone for now. Anyways, the traditional printing, we're always kind of banking on the last 250, 500 copies selling, and that's being where your profit is. So the per book cost for printing go down dramatically at certain levels that you hit. And you can look at it and be oh, if I print 2,500 copies, each book is $3. If I print 3,000 copies, each book is $2.42. The last 500 is free. If we sell those, we're going to make a lot of money. But if we don't, they'll sit in Ingram's warehouse and you have to pay 10 cents per unit every month forever.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And a lot of copies of a book, it takes off. It becomes like a sensation. It's selling very well. It can be very slow to get those books into print. And anytime that you don't have copies available, you lose a lot of sales. People don't come back to things. They want it in the moment. They don't. If it's not there, they're not going to get it.
I was just saying,
So that would be a change.
I was listening to your interview with Ben on Beyond the Zero, and I was really kind of surprised because I remember you talking about both Zone by Matthias Inard, and then also some of the kind of during the transition with Dalkey, when there were just so many excess books sitting in storage, and the amount of storage fees that you were paying. That blew my mind. That was not something that I ever really considered in the world of publishing.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. I think we pay $1,000 a month right now just for open letter books to be warehoused.
Wow.
Which I thought I'd cut it down even further than that, but I'll have to look again and try and reduce whatever the excess stuff is, which is one of the, not to tie this back into it, but Women in Translation Month, when we have this deep discount 40% sale, part of it is to make sure that we can, or to help get rid of some of that excess inventory so we don't pay for it. It's converted into readership.
Yeah, I would imagine too that there's probably a decent amount of people like picking up stuff that's not on sale. Oh, I'm here. I'm placing an order. Let me grab, this isn't 40% off, but let me grab this while I'm here. So that helps. I was kind of thinking like after, like Andy had said, after listening to the Beyond the Zero interview, I was like, oh, maybe, the sale is, they probably make no money on that. It's probably like to help them kind of break even, get stuff out of the warehouse, kind of clean up shop. Interestingly, a lot of people don't know this, and I actually don't know if this is still true, but the car dealership and motorcycle dealership industry works in a similar way. So I used to be the sales manager of a motorcycle dealership, and they pay financing. They actually don't buy all the inventory. They're financing it as it sits on the showroom floor. And so when I took over, there were bikes that were maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 years old, brand new, still sitting there. And the owner of the dealership was like, I've already lost money on this. I just want to get some cash back in my pocket, sell them for whatever you can sell them for. And, I think it's makes me wonder, as we see all these different industries kind of condensing down, and my industry is a lot like that with video production. Back in the day, you would maybe just be a camera operator or just a sound guy or just an editor. Now, like, you see people doing all those jobs because the technology is cheaper and it's easier to use. A lot of it's automated. Do you think it'll ever get to a point where maybe publishing companies are printing their own books? Does anyone already do that?
I think the investment in the actual printer is too high. Instead, like what happened was Simon and Schuster, I think, but it might have been Random House or both, bought a printer during the pandemic. And then once they own that printing company, their books were the number one priority. And during the pandemic, like getting things printed was like unreal. And the prices shot up. It took 6 to 8 months to print anything. Paper wasn't available. Whole problem, whole nightmare. And so Simon Schuster, I'm sure it was them, solved this by just like buying one and saying, we're number one. Everyone else can come second. Make your money. It's going to flow up to us, but we don't have any problems getting our books out on time. So that seems like a more reasonable explanation or a reasonable process. But for printing books, even at indie press level, I think it's just such a huge investment to make it professional. And there still is, like, for anyone who likes print books, like the quality has to be there. Otherwise, it's just like it gets crapped on.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a lot like the album industry where people thought that digital would completely destroy the physical media experience. Right. But then there are just, it seems like a large group of people in that medium and in books that just love to have the tangible item. and it's part of the experience. I'm certainly that way. And actually, somebody just asked me, they're like, why do publishers send you free books to talk about on social media? Why don't they just send you a digital file? I go, because if I don't have it to hold in my hand for a video or a photo, it's like not cool. It just it's just not as good of an experience for the viewer on social media even. So
Yeah, that is a huge thing that switched in the pandemic too, and is interesting. Might turn into the second point that I want to make about the future. With during the pandemic, nobody would accept books. Everyone started leaning on Edelweiss, where we could upload our digital review copies instantly, and people can request them within minutes. Right? We did this on Friday with Mother River by Shen Sui. The new book of hers that's coming out in January went up on Edelweiss and got more requests than we received for any book of ours for the past like 2 years within the next few hours.
Wow.
So there is like an interesting group of people, or a sub readership, sub reviewership, sub booksellership that really is happy with the digital part. And then there is the entire social media side of things, which if we don't have the physical copies, galley or whatever, it doesn't make any sense. And the social media side of things is far more important, no offense to booksellers, than the booksellers buying and reading it.
yeah.
It's just, you reach so many more people. It's not localized. It's global. It's all the things that you can start a trend, whereas it's hard for a bookstore to try a trend, so on and so forth. So my second point might be that as time changes, there will remain the like 50 to 100 really great literary bookstores scattered throughout the country, but publishers are going to focus more and more and more and more on like to consumer sales and marketing, primarily marketing.
I would have to agree with that. I have never asked a bookseller, I'm at the store, like what I should buy, but I've asked or been influenced by so many people on social media, like, hey, I'm going to the bookstore today. What have you been reading? Or, I'll see a post from someone and like, oh, I'm going to go see if my bookstore has that. Like it's so much more influential to see what's being shared on social media than talking to someone at the bookstore.
I mean, more than anything, I think it's just about scalability, right? Like, I've made posts kind of offhand. I'm just going to upload something really quick, kind of don't even do my normal setup, just film something with my phone, hit upload, go grab lunch with friends, and I pull my phone out 2 hours later and it's been seen 60,000 times.
Yeah.
And people are like, I'm going to go out and buy that book. That sounds amazing. And it's so the scalability potential of the internet's just, you just cannot compete with it. So that's interesting. I'm glad that I think it's important for people to kind of hear the insights behind the publishing industry, especially for a small or independent press, because if you are a Simon & Schuster or a Penguin, you can go out and acquire a whole, printing company. And hey, that's even better than just buying the equipment, right? Because they probably already have a book of business to offset the cost. So, but the University of Rochester and Open Letter Books probably aren't going to be, making any acquisitions anytime soon. And so I
think the University of Rochester wants to spend money on the arts.
Right. So, when I first started kind of this influencer journey, I got a lot of flack from people about buying books. And I'm like, hey, I'm buying books from independent bookstores, from small publishing companies. Like, I'm happy to spend some of my money on supporting this stuff. And I get it. You can make the case for environmental concerns with printing and all that stuff. But I do think it is important to, if we want to keep the arts going, we're going to have to invest money in it by purchasing these works of art. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
not that either of us need an excuse to buy more books.
Yeah. Well, that's a topic for another day. But so let's talk about Women in Translation Month. Andy's got some great questions for you, but I want to kind of prompt this segment of the conversation with why, in your words, as someone that works in the industry, you also teach at the University of Rochester. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So why is it important for people to read works in translation? Give me your sales pitch on that. And why is it important for people to specifically seek out art created by women?
Yeah, I mean, my pitch has evolved over the years. There's usually like the sort of like translations make you a better person. It's hard to go to war with a country that you understand the people. That kind of vibe of it has never exactly been my thing. I've just always been attracted to the fact that international literature has more room for experimentation and for things that are outside of the kind of codified way to tell a story. That in America has become extremely, I mean, there's a lot of variety. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of great American writers. There's a lot of great British writers. There's amazing people from all over the world that I love to read and that don't fit this specific sort of painting with a broad brush or whatever the phrase is. But there is like kind of a sort of slope towards like what makes sense from a marketing and sales perspective, that America is so geared towards its capitalist moment and to squeezing out those margins. Like nobody in this industry is making a lot of money, although Random House made, millions of dollars of profits. It's still like a percentage that's so much smaller than other industries that it seems like whatever. That's, we made a 3% profit. That's terrible. Regardless, everything is focused on getting that last drop and being able to fit into the right categories, the right kind of things to make people buy enough copies to support yourself. And as time's gone on through like our late capitalist moment, there's become a huge divide between those books that take off and the ones that don't. The books that used to sell like 3,000 copies, which was you could make it by selling 3,000 copies and getting some donations from the NEA and foreign governments and whatever, you could do that. Now those are selling like 800. But the books that were selling like 10 or 20,000 are selling 60,000.
Wow.
So like that scale is like spreading further and further and further apart, which is super complicated to deal with. So with that, a lot of people are trying to like write towards that 60,000 number. And I think that international literature doesn't always do that. They're trying to accomplish something that's artistic, that's structurally unique, that has a different kind of viewpoint, that's playful. There's a lot more play in a lot of the books that we do from other parts of the world. I really enjoy that. It doesn't feel so scripted, so like overly like cast into like the MFA model or like what works within the Amazon model or anything like that. Again, painting with a broad brush or whatever. And but that's one thing, is I just like them. But when we started the translation database back in 2008, we started counting every book in translation that came out into English that was a work of fiction or poetry for the first time ever. So no retranslations of Dostoevsky, just new voices. And when I did that, I looked at the number of male versus female writers, and it was like 24% female, 76% male, which seems like a pretty ratio.
Yeah.
So, and this is all thanks to Madela Redzinski. She really started the Women in Translation like hashtag and the whole movement, and that was in 2014. That wasn't even that long ago, and it was years after this sort of discrepancy was noted. But through that, I think that the main key is that women in translation get really overlooked. Dubravka Greshek writes about this a lot, or wrote about it a lot until she passed away, RIP. Best to her, she's one of my favorites. But she would write essays about how if you are a female writer from a small language, you are at the biggest disadvantage on the global marketplace. That you're very rarely going to be able to take off and get the kind of attention that some mid-list male writer will get. Now, that top 100 books of the 21st century or whatever, to have Elena Ferrante at the top sort of like throws a little wrench in that, but not entirely, because her books, no offense to anyone listening, I think are pretty conventional and that they fit a certain mode. I also have questions about the whole editing and translation process of those. I'm not going to say more than that. That one I'm giving to myself.
Okay.
But the fact that she's there is wonderful. But when we do books by women, it's much less likely for them to get reviewed or to get any sort of normal attention, to get the bookstore praise, any of that. The sales levels are slightly lower. I think this is a built-in like problem among the readership. And by bringing attention to women in translation, even if it's just for a month exclusively, and showing people these are amazing, these books are the same level as anything else. Stop treating them even as like women in translation versus men in translation. There's X versus Y, or like the men are from Mars. They are fantastic books, but they fly under the radar because this sort of system doesn't always recognize them. Like it sucks, and I don't know exactly what the kind of evolutionary causes are for that, but it needs to be reversed, and this is like one step in that way. To put the cherry on that, last year I did a research, and half of the books published in translation were by men and half were by women. It was almost exactly even.
Wow.
And that was the first time that had happened since the beginning of this whole process. So it's working. We're getting more voices from around the world that aren't just like the dominant male voice from a particular culture. And I think that's really key.
Yeah, interestingly, it's a bit of a contentious issue. So almost weekly, I probably get a comment on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, somewhere on my social media footprint, usually from a woman saying, "Where are all the women? Why didn't you talk about women in this episode?" And it's, I'm not calculating my actual ratio, but Andy and I talk about books written by women all the time. And I call it like flyby engagement. Somebody sees one piece of content and there's not a satisfactory amount of women writers to them, and they kind of want to beat you over the head about it. On the flip side, someone had asked me, what are my top 5 favorite books written by women? And I was like, oh, that's a great idea for a video, for just a short form piece of content. And so I made the list. I did 5 nonfiction and 5 fiction. And I realized that a lot of it's modern stuff. And I was like, I need to read more classics written by women. So I picked up The Good Earth off my shelf. I already had a copy of it, never read it. And when I did a review of it, I just mentioned I felt like I needed to read more classics written by women. And I got comments, why do you need to read more books written by women? Who cares? You know what I mean? And it's just like, geez.
You can't win. It's so tough. Yeah. I was talking about it with someone recently, about what Tony was saying, how we get these comments weekly, like, why are you not talking about women? And I maybe this is, a little bit of a mistake on our part, but, lately we've been doing a lot of like listicle type episodes, 5, favorite short books, things like that. And whether it's not intentional, I think it's just a coincidence for both of us. I think our favorite books tend to be written by men, or the books that we end up talking about are written by men. So, we do this episode, we talk about 10 books collectively. They're all written by men. And then people are like, oh, these are just a couple of total bros that don't read anything by women. They go out of their way to just only read men. And I'm like, I've read a number of books by women this year. They just didn't happen to make the cut for this episode. Like, like Tony said, like, it's just a single piece of content, of engagement, that they don't see the bigger picture. Like, it's frustrating. You can't win.
But the comment I got, one of the comments I got asking, why do you need to, do we lose you, Chad?
I hope not.
Oh, no. Okay. Sorry. I thought you were talking. I couldn't hear you.
I'm counting.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, one of the comments I got on TikTok about, why does it matter that they're women? And I said, well, historically speaking, women have not been given as many opportunities, which means the books that did get published were probably quite good. And not only that, but I think it's very normal for men to look up to men as they grow up and see their idols in sports or art or whatever, and for women to do the same thing. So if we follow that logic, then that means a lot of the current books written by women are probably influenced by the classics written by women. So I want to read those texts and see where some of these maybe allusions are pointing to, or the inspirations. And I thought it was funny. Somebody responded to this comment chain and they're like, wow, Tony just like slapped you basically. And the guy deleted his comment. I was like, I wasn't being a dink about it, but it was kind of a silly question, bro.
That's the difference between Tony and I. Like, he'll actually put together like a thoughtful response if it is a thoughtful question or worthy of a legitimate response. Whereas I'm just going to be a snarky asshole. Yeah. Someone commented on one of our posts recently and was, again, something along the lines of like, why aren't you talking about anything by women? I don't even remember what post it was.
It was a 20-second snippet of a podcast episode.
Yeah. And they said something about why we weren't talking about books written by women. And I said, I'm saving myself for marriage.
Oh my God.
And she was not happy.
Yeah, they didn't appreciate it. But at the end of the day, I do think I agree with you, Chad. It is important to give a platform to those voices, because I'm sure there's a number of reasons why, but like you said, it doesn't seem like women writers have been given the same opportunities. And I don't think we have the time to get into the why of that, but trending on this topic. Oh, go ahead.
I do have two things I want to add. One is, well, first of all, that's all of that's like small sample size problems. Everyone sees a bit and they, like you say, fly by commenting, but it's like the small sample size. You haven't seen all the episodes. On our top 15 books that have life to date sales, total sales maximum, out of the 15 books, 7 are written by women, including spaces 1 through 5.
Wow, that's awesome.
Which is interesting. Also related to that, I think that for a while, editors played a bad role in this, is that they're primarily male. And if they're doing female books, the ones that were successful, that were written by women, fit into like the sort of rom-com-y sort of like romance trope. So they looked for things that fit that, which aren't necessarily good crossover books.
Right.
And all the women that were writing like serious literature, where they were being kind of ignored in favor of like the big poppy Devil Wears Prada sort of books.
That's another thing I've talked about on the show, is that for better or worse, the types of books that I like to read or that get published, are mostly written by men. And, a lot of the prominent female authors, at least in the 21st century, tend to write things more in the vein of that kind of rom-com fantasy genre, which I'm just not a fan of. So I'm not going to go out of my way to read those novels just so I can say I read a book by a woman.
Well, it's a trickle-down effect, right? If the women are getting less opportunities to write and have their work published, then as consumers, we have less opportunities and options to choose from for women writers, particularly in genres that aren't marketed to, like literature, for example. Like you said, they filter a lot into the romantasy or rom-com.
Yeah.
And if people are reading, I think that's great, no matter what they're reading. But it is tough. The literature market certainly doesn't get the same amount of shine. So what are some of your what are those top 5 books? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I'll read them to you. It's interesting. Okay, number 1 is Winter in Sok-cho by Elisa Shuadusapin,
which both of us have read.
2 is Garden by the Sea by Mercy Rodoreda. 3, Pachinko Parlor by Elisa Shuadusapin. Flowers of Mold by Ha-Song Nan.
Oh, I've read some of those.
And then Death in
stories.
Spring by Mercy Rodoreda.
Cool.
What was the last one?
So, Death in Spring.
Okay.
You have a copy.
Yeah, I have a copy of that. You just ordered a copy of that.
Yeah, you're shipping mine out
That
today,
was-
I guess.
That was our number 1 book forever, and it just kind of fell down to 5th.
Really?
All right, I guess we have to read that soon.
Yeah. So
Oh,
what do you
dude, you're gonna
attribute?
love that. That book is amazing.
What do you attribute Winter and Sok-cho's success to? We talked about it briefly via Instagram, but for our audience listening.
Well, it was interesting because the book came out in the UK on March 2020. So it got buried there amid all the pandemic stuff. And we brought it out a year later, maybe a year and a few months later, and it immediately started selling pretty well. Like our distributor gives you these like projections, like what they think the book will do in its first like 6 months. And I looked at it and was like, wow, this is woefully low. This book is incredibly readable. It's sparse. It fits a certain like mold. It's short. It's got like a lot of things going for it. It's got a beautiful cover. It's got the right,
awesome.
like everything. And I was like, it'll sell like double what they're saying. So we did print far more than they told us to. And it sold out almost right away. And in the process of getting more copies printed, it won the National Book Award. And that kicked off like a whole slew of things. And that was like, I mean, we should have sold probably double the number of copies that we've sold, but we couldn't get it printed because it was 2021. Everything was like fucked. The printing took like 5 months. So I think we had to keep doing LSI runs over and over and over and over again to try and build out while we were waiting for the copies with the French flaps and with all like the bells and whistles to arrive. And then as part of the National Book Award, it got picked up within like the book talk sphere. And that kept it going. And so the new books of hers do quite well. Not quite as well as that one did, because that one's kind of been crowned as like the award winner of the big book, so on and so forth. But she did enter into that sphere and was reaching readers that we don't normally reach. Because we're heavily relying on like the kind of New York Times book review, sort of staid like classics, and then like the indie bookstores, which have their own sort of reach that I think is outside of some of the book talk stuff. That the book talk stuff goes much further and much different sort of like audience that's more extremely online, doesn't really necessarily go to stores, but buys things through Amazon or wherever. They learned about the book through there. And that helped like expand that audience greatly.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I actually saw Winter and Sok-cho on TikTok, multiple people reviewing it, and like people that certainly aren't popping up in my feed that often because they're not talking about the same books. And I was like, wow, I've read that book. That's an open letter book. That's surprising. I do think the cover design was a big part of that. It is such a cool cover. I mean, it's a good book. Don't get me wrong. Like the book is good, but that's like one of my favorite covers on my entire bookshelf. So
I want to unveil something.
Oh, let's see it.
So you guys have read the book. So two things. One, if my students, every year I teach a class on publishing both semesters. Most of the students in there are sophomores, maybe juniors, right? Like they're like in that age. And they'll always be like, well, we've never heard of Open Letter because even though you're on campus, we don't know who you are. And I'm like, well, you probably don't read a lot of books either. Like, no offense, but you're busy with school. You're not like in the book ecosystem. But recently, they've all been like, I know about you from Winter and Sok-cho on TikTok. Every time.
Wow.
Secondly, the end of that book where she's going to serve him the fish, I kept proffering the interpretation that she's going to kill them both. She's clumsy. She doesn't know how to cut the fish right. It's all like designed to be like kind of a suicidal death moment. And I met Elisa for the first time this past spring. And I was like, I need to tell you this. Like, I don't know like how you'd feel if I had said this, but this is what I think. She's like, no, that's what it's supposed to be.
Oh, wow.
No, none of my students ever agreed with me. They're all like, you're crazy. Like, no. There's no like undertones. I was like, I think textually there's every reason to believe she's fucked this up and they're going to die.
Wow.
I think I have to go back and reread it now.
Yeah, I don't recall having that thought. So that's a nice little a nice little tidbit there. So what can you take us through? What does the process from start to finish look like to get a book translated? How are the books picked? How long does the translation take? How many times does somebody have to read it? Who kind of like fact checks the translation? Just take us like maybe the 30,000 foot view, but of the process, because I have zero idea how this works.
Yeah, there's a few different ways that you can get the information about the book that you want to publish. It can be from an agent or a foreign publisher will send us like a lot of recommendations. They'll want to meet at Frankfurt. They want to meet at the London Book Fair. They pitch you like, here's the cool new book. Everyone's interested in this. They frequently are trying to play publishers off one another. So they're like, oh, Transit's really interested in this book. Maybe you'll want to take a look too. And then the second you make an offer, they're like, oh, we're going to take this offer out to all of the other people who are reading it and see if we can get a better offer. It's like a really like crass, like truly like money-based way system.
Money talks.
I'm not a big fan of that. And for a couple reasons, like I find it very disingenuous. It's like it takes publishing into the realm of production and money instead of like good fit. Like we're a better fit for certain authors than bigger presses are. It has been demonstrated by Dubravka Grishik. She went to HarperCollins and was like, this sucks. Like there's no support. There's not like the book sold far fewer copies than it did when we did it, like her book did, than the ones that we published. Like she's like, this is, not for me. Like they gave me a good advance, but the process isn't great. So if the fit should be important, and agents and that whole scheme, that gets ignored for the most part. Not entirely. They'll pay lip service to it, but it's not really the big thing. And also, like, I don't care for being in competition with people in such an industry as this. It's already just not that profitable at all. Like, it's negatively profitable. It's a loss. So to up your advances, to up all this money, up all this stuff, so that you can lose more is not the best scheme. Also, I'm not always sure the books they're pitching to us are the books I want to do. I want to do books that are classics that have lasted for 5 years, that aren't just like came out 3 months ago and people like them and are going to forget about them by the time you bring out the translation. Much more interested in things that are going to stand some test of time, be it 10 years, be it 100. But I'd like to do those books, and books that aren't part of the mainstream, that are like weirder. Those are the books I like. I mean, for whatever it's worth, that's just what I like. And as a publisher and editor, that's what I'm drawn to, and that's what we will focus on. The way we get a lot of books, though, is through the translators who are working on stuff that's older, that's been around, or they have like a different sort of view into things that the agents don't always provide because they're trying to hype their own product, right? So we get books that way, recommendations. Then we have to do two big things. One is we have to acquire the rights to the book itself. And that can be from the author, the agent, the original publisher. Those are the three main ways. We have to find that and get those rights. At the same time, we're sort of calculating, like, what would the sales for this be and where can we get other funding? Is there translation grants available from X country? Is there like promotional grants available? Would we include this in the NEA grant application? Like, those kind of pieces of it happen around the same time. But we acquire the rights to the book, hopefully for worldwide English versions, and then we contract with a translator. Translators work at their own pace. Each of them are different. Depending on who they are and what's going on in their lives, it can be like, oh, can you get this book done in 4 months? They'll be like, no problem. And they're done in 3.
Wow.
Most of them ask for extensions. So we plan out usually like a 9-month period for the translator to translate any given book. That allows us time that if they come in early, we can possibly move the book up in our schedule. But they also have like a few month leeway for when it inevitably comes in late. This is important, and I don't want to get into the weeds of this, but this is important because of how we announce books through our distributor. So right now, Ingram is announcing everything we're publishing through August of 2025. So we need those books here so we can use them for the sales reps, for promotions, for anything like to get them excited about them, which is hard to do because the sales reps are promoting thousands of books and they're not going to read every one. And like, we are just a small drop in that giant bucket. But if we have the books, if we have the text, the translations, we have a shot. So we have to do things far, 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 far in advance. When the book comes in, I will read it first. And I edit with kind of 2 modes. These can be split apart in a bigger publishing company, but for us, they're kind of bundled together. One is the more substantive changes, like the tone is wrong. Let's change these words, rearrange these sentences. If there is like something really problematic in the text itself, where like this doesn't have the motivation, these parts should be rearranged, these paragraphs should be reversed, I'll bring that up, but that's pretty rare. That's not usually the case. It's a lot more like kind of line editing, sometimes cutting things, but frequently like trying to make it work in English as if I were born in English.
Right.
At the same time, I'm more or less like copy editing the punctuation and fixing all the ellipses, which apparently no translator in the world knows how to do correctly. The M dashes, the shit that like a copy editor intern would do, where they're like, checking the spellings, like looking up the word. I'll do a lot of that kind of on the first pass so that it's like clean. But with the editing part, I'll make my suggestions. I'll make some comments, which, as anyone who's worked with me knows, some of those comments are realistic. Some of those are just like stray thoughts or like reminders of like, oh, this ties into this other book we have, or like dumb jokes. A lot of dumb jokes. But then there will also be parts I put in yellow. And the parts I put in yellow that highlight, those are ones I want the translator to go back to and just revisit. maybe they won't change anything, but frequently that draws enough attention where they're like, yeah, that sounded wrong to me too, but I don't know what to do. And then rethink through and find like another way to say whatever was there that works a lot better. Then the book comes back, and depending on what the level of changes were, either I'll read it again then to make sure it's clean, and depending on the translator, she's never going to listen to this. So I'll tell you that one of the ones, one of the translators I love working with, absolutely my favorite person to work with, but is Katie Whittemore, who when she sends back her edits and replies to my edits, there are so many missing words or like duplicated things. I have to read it before we typeset it because otherwise it's a massive corrections to fix after you typeset. She's one that needs 2 readings because inevitably there are things that filter through.
And she's done a lot of books for you guys, right?
So many.
Yeah, I saw. I had a feeling you were going to say her name because I saw her name when I was looking at the Women in Translation sale. I saw her name on a ton of books.
Man, I know at least 2 of the open letter books I've read have been translated by her, and I'm sure I have more either on my shelf or on the way that are translated by her.
She does Spanish, is that correct?
Yeah, she does Spanish, Spanish authors from Spain.
Gotcha.
Primarily female writers, but a couple men. But the female writers like Sarah Mesa is like one of our like blockbuster top-notch authors, and she does all of her books now. And that's key. And then we expanded out from that into a few other female writers from Spain. And then last year, her big book that she had pitched to me during the pandemic, and I think we outbid New Directions for it. Essentially, New Directions was interested. They may not have gone all the way to like we're going to make an offer, but they were very curious. Was Not Even the Dead by Juan Gomez Barcena, which ended up being one of the New York Times best 50 fiction works of the year. And got like a huge review, and it's a very giant book, but she did that one as well. But yeah, she's done a ton, and she's got a few more lined up still.
I would imagine it really probably helps to have the same translator translating the same author because they get used to each other's tone and style and workflow, right?
Exactly. And they can exchange information. They're like good friends.
Nice.
So it's like way easier to like, overcome any obstacles or answer any questions that you might have, all that kind of stuff. And I do like working with the same translators over and over because I kind of know what to expect, what they're going to be like, how are they going to be on time, not on time, what is the process going to be like, all of that makes sense. And there's sort of it's not a Occam's razor situation, but some way in which you kind of cut through a lot of crap by knowing who you're working with.
Yeah.
And when we're like essentially 2 people and more or less one, the fewer distractions, the fewer excess that I need to deal with, the better. And as long as the quality remains as high as possible, then I prefer that. But we do like to mix in new translators, new voices, new things. At the same time, we're committed to doing these authors like Rodrigo Frazan, like Sarah Mesa, like Andres Newman, like Dubravka, Shen Sui. There's a bunch of authors that we do over and over and over again, and that takes up a lot of our slots. So we don't have a ton of space for bringing in a ton of new voices like I'd love to. Like I did that at the beginning and I absolutely love it. And I love working with young translators. And I think the whole process is really illuminating and fun. But given like kind of the structural constraints, we've sort of fallen into a pattern where it's easier to work with the same people on these authors that we want to support throughout their whole career.
So there's some back and forth, between you and the translator. Like you said, sometimes you have to do a second pass before the typesetting. How much say does the original author have? And is it necessary that they speak English? Does it help if they do or don't?
It's a case-by-case basis. Sometimes they want to be involved. Sometimes they really don't. Like, I think Frazan is like maybe kind of in the middle. Like he likes to like give his input on the cover, especially, and on some of the stuff within the text of the book. But outside of that, he's like, this is Will Vanderheiden's book. This is not this is his book, his writing. I don't think he proofs many of the, but he knows English very, very well. He reads English. He writes in English. He's completely fluent, but I don't think he proofs it. He'll glance through and find like the big problems. Like in the first, I don't know if it went out as a galley, but the first typesetting of Melville, his new book, had the same footnote repeated 7 times at the end. And one of my interns proofed it. It was like, is this some sort of experimental thing that's going on? Like, whatever. It's like, nope, just a typo.
That's amazing.
That's funny.
He finds that, but he doesn't go through it bit by bit. I've had authors that are like very fluent in English and really like tough to work with because they think that they understand the nuances and don't. And then we've had people who they're like, I don't understand English. I don't care. Like, it's your book. You guys, I trust you. And there has to be that level of trust.
Yeah. Oddly enough, my appreciation for how difficult translating can be comes from Reddit and motorsports. So I'm a big motorsports fan, which, Formula One, MotoGP, which are not big in the US.
Yeah.
Or traditionally, are kind of European markets. So a lot of the drivers and athletes are Spanish, Italian, maybe South American. And, there's always like news headlines, and the original interview was in Italian, and then it gets translated and it sounds like this guy said something kind of like he's kind of a prick, and then you see people like on Reddit who are like, I'm Italian. Like, that's not really what that means. Like, the words might translate directly to that, but like the intention behind that phrase or that slang is not what doesn't sound right in English, or in American English. So, and you're like, okay, it's like, it's more than just this word means that. It's so much about the concept of what is trying to be said. It must be a massive undertaking.
Yeah, for sure. And there's like layers and layers and layers to it. Like with Spanish, I know kind of the best because I know enough Spanish to get by. But one of the quirks of it is that there's a lot of added words like that and things like that go into the text. And so when you look at it just from a structural perspective and do a search for that, you can tell how advanced the translator is based on like how many unnecessary instances there are of that. So there's like one level where it's like, we just need to get the sentences straight. Into like English. And then there's like the dialogue question, like kind of what you're saying, like, where does it sound natural? Like, people that are translating kind of like word for word or line for line even will have dialogue that just sounds so wooden. And Jon O'Brien, like my mentor from Dalkey, he would always work with the translators, especially young ones, which he absolutely loved, by reading the book aloud. And so they would go out, he'd go out on like this picnic table outside of our offices at Dalkey with frequently like a translator that was working in house. That was like a grad student or beyond that was like there to translate X number of books over the course of a year. They'd do a translation and they'd sit outside on this bench and read it aloud. And he would frequently be like, have you ever heard anyone in English ever say those words in that order? Nobody's ever said that. So no, we're not including that in the book. And they'll be like, but that's what it says in the original. He's like, no, it doesn't. Like, it doesn't sound like something that no Italian has ever said in their life. It sounds like something Italians have said. It needs to sound like something English people have said.
Right.
Not just like random translationese.
From the very little I've heard about Jon O'Brien, I can very much picture him doing that.
Well, a funny tangent. So Andy and I, we listened to your interview on Beyond the Zero just so we could ask, somewhat informed questions and not repeat anything that's already out there, just, to get some fresh conversation going. And I'm actually not a big podcast person. So I was like, I'm going to go to the gym, walk on the treadmill and listen to this podcast. And you're like, yeah, Jon O'Brien died suddenly of a heart attack on a treadmill. And I was like looking around like, if I croak right now, like, is somebody going to be able to resuscitate me?
John died in his sleep. Cliff Becker from the NEA was the one who died on the treadmill.
Okay. I'm sorry. My apologies to John's family for the confusion.
Far scarier.
Yeah.
Far scarier, because I think Cliff was like my age now.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, but it was just, it kind of freaked me out. I was like, I'm literally on a treadmill right now. Like,
yes.
So, Andy, I know you had some questions for Chad regarding like some of his favorite work.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to what you were talking about with the whole translation process. I mean, you kind of talked about how you look for things that are a little bit left of center, not really mainstream, more experimental and playful. Those are all kind of general. Are there any specific things that you look for in a translation, whether it's personal taste or something that you think will make it be a successful translation into English?
Oh, those are maybe 2 or 3 different questions. One is I know right away things I don't like. I don't like things that have talking animals. If there's a talking animal in the book, get out of here. Like, I hate that. Absolutely not.
The Bible's out.
But in terms, it's just no. Animal Farm, oh no, no way. The thing I do look for is like a larger structure. And sometimes that's hard to figure out in terms of like looking at samples plus like reviews plus
Right.
like the kind of materials that you get. That's not always evident, but if you can figure it out, I like the grand over like meta structure to things. There's a great book called Spiral, Meander, Explode that, God, what's the author's name? Allison something or something Allison. And it's spectacular about like different structures that people use rather than like the growing to a climax, the denouement. That sort of Freytag's triangle is like one structure, but she writes in this book about how there are so many other structures that are mapped off of like things in nature, like spirals, like wavelets, like all sorts of ways that you can think about how books are structured, both on like a paragraph level and on like a meta level, that are so much more interesting than like, let's build to a climax, let's have a denouement. And you can pick that up within like the paragraphs that something interesting is happening here. This person isn't trying to tell just a neo-realistic X to Z sort, X is A to Z sort of story where everything that you encounter is going to be like mappable onto real life in a visual sense. If there's not that textual level of like where you have to pay attention to the words as much as the images that you're seeing when you read, that's automatically something that appeals to me. And then if I can see that there are like branches going out from the paragraph, that it's not just like keeping itself into this one fit place, I tend to respect those a lot more. So I look for that kind of thing. Like we'll go to Sarah Mace as an easy example. Her books have like a really interesting tension in terms of like power structures, in terms of like relation to like a reality that's not quite a reality, but feels like it is. Like things can be a little bit beyond the neo-realistic, and yet at the same time, they are very strikingly visual. So those books work really well for me. I really like that. In terms of books I think will sell, sometimes those aren't always the same. Sometimes they're like this book is spectacular. I think this book is like supremely well written, but I don't know that it's going to really catch on. And sometimes I'm wrong. Like Zone is one that I believed in fully and then got cold feet over and was like, I don't know, man. This is a 1-sentence book, 517 pages long. People are going to freak their shit out. It's French. All of the things that, can be red flags for certain readers. And
those are all green flags for me.
Yeah.
I know. Me too. I was like, yes. But when you're like, I'm going to spend $20,000 printing this book, then it becomes like orange flags.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of the problem, right? If you have kind of niche interests, you can't just look at yourself and say, well, what would I do? Would I buy this book? Because it's not going to give you a good indication of whether it'll be commercially successful or not.
Yeah, I like to just treat them separately. Like when I have students write readers reports, I'm like, do not take into account any other potential reader. If you're evaluating this book, you're telling me if you think it's great or you think it sucks. No one else, because you can't really know how much of a readership you represent. Like I know that my taste represents a pretty minimal but like significant scope of readers. There's an old line that Jon O'Brien would say that James Laughlin from New Directions told him, that James Laughlin was like, there's only 20,000 serious readers at any moment in time. No matter the size of the population, no matter anything else, there's 20,000 serious readers.
Wow.
You will not capture all of them with any one book. And you'll have certain readers outside of that group that might buy your book, but there's only really that number. And if you're within that scope in 1960 or 2024, you're sort of working within that as your pool of like serious readers. And then maybe your book breaks out, whatever. But when I'm reading and really like something, it's those people that I think it's sort of mapping onto. And for a small independent press, that's fine. We're doing literature. We're not doing blockbusters. For like a Simon Schuster, whatever, they would be like, oh, no, that's horrible.
Right.
We need an audience of 1 million.
One thing that I was really interested in when listening to that interview you did with Ben was kind of hearing you talk about the traveling you did with Jon O'Brien when Dalkey first started to really expand into translated works. In general, I would love to hear more about those travels. And then, is there anything from those trips that you kind of took away and has informed your experience starting Open Letter with the translations you do at Open Letter? I don't really know where I'm going with this question, but just takeaways from those trips that have really influenced you and that you've learned from and impacted the work you're doing now.
Yeah, the trips were fantastic. I mean, they were both very enjoyable because the countries that are bringing you over to try and interest you in their literature. So be it like Norway, be it Denmark, Germany, wherever, Austria, they want Estonia in particular. They want to impress you to some degree. So they try and set up all the best things about their culture, about their dining experiences, about the sightseeing. Everything is here is a very cool picture of our country, and our culture is a part of that. Our literary culture is a part of that. And here we're kind of blending together the beautiful restaurant and the best authors. And so on a very visceral level, those trips are amazing. Even if we did them one-on-one, it was just the two of us and the foreign agency that set it up. And nowadays, most of them are more of a group experience. But even when it's a group experience, you have the chance to see really cool things, meet really interesting people in a situation where that's what's important, rather than being distracted by 9,000 things at Frankfurt and meeting people for 20 minutes or having a drink and mid 500 people. It's you're very kind of concentrated bubble experience. And that's amazing. And if you take advantage of it, which I don't know that everyone does among the editorial staff that I've been on trips with, but I was deep into every one of these places. Before we'd go, I'd read as many books as I could or know as many names as I could about the region before we got there. And then you sort of hit with that runway where some younger contemporary authors talking about someone's work and referencing back to these classics that we do know of or they didn't know of. And then we took that, John did too, took all of it very, 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 very in good faith, to taking notes on which books to do, coming up with a list when we got home of 10 to 15 books from every country that would be here's a roadmap for the next 5 to 8 years from this country. There'll be new contemporary things that come out that are worthy, but this is a blend of here are the Matti Unz of Estonia, who had passed away by the time we went there, but was the big contemporary modernist figure. Do his books. Plus, here's 4 authors that are working today that sort of fit into that, all that kind of scope. And I took that over to Open Letter for sure, of trying to find that sort of group of authors that wasn't confined to one particular thing, or one particular era, but kind of went throughout the country's history and hit at different angles. And then the other thing was that there are presses in almost every country that sort of map onto Open Letter or Dalkey. It depends. Some of the countries are different. There'll be certain publishers in certain countries that prefer to do translations and not original books from the language in which their company is based. And they'll be all the same translations we're doing. So it could be oh, we're doing this Norwegian book, and this Polish publisher will be we're doing that same Norwegian book. Or when I went to Norway last, everyone was doing Sarah Mesa. Everyone was all over that. So it's Jesus, this is crazy. We're all connecting over her books from people from different countries and from Norway itself. And I'll pay attention to those publishing houses, because if we have some overlap, there's some sort of brother sisterhood that's going on there. And so if they're doing a book from, if say an Austrian publisher is doing an Estonian author, and they have a lot of authors in common with us, that Estonian author is probably pretty interesting and worth looking into. So trying to keep that kind of idea in mind, that there are these single one-off sort of presses everywhere in the world that are doing something similar to what my personal reading interests are, makes it cool to see kind of the web of connections and where certain books can move from one country to another. And we might not know it directly, but we'll know it through this kind of third party.
So that is a great segue into my next question, which is, in 2024, which country do you think is the most exciting with the literature coming out of there, or maybe the the powerhouse? Because I mean, you go on to social media and a lot of the literature discussion is kind of like literature 101, a lot of Dostoevsky and Dumas and the big name classics, but there's a lot of, I mean, Estonia, like you don't think of Estonia as a literary powerhouse, but I've like read a book from Estonia that was pretty damn cool, So
Yeah.
in your perspective, who's like the top dog right now?
God, that's such a hard question to answer. For a while, back when I was at Dalkey in the beginning, France was still it. France was definitely it. And there was all the kind of minimalist writers, the Jean Echenot, the Christian Auster, Chevillard, Lydie Salvaire, who I love. Bunch of authors like that are being published by Minuit and POL that were doing something like unique and interesting and funny. And those were fantastic. And I would have said at that time, France by far most exciting. Did that convert into like big sales for all these authors? No. However, 20 years later, Eric Chevillard is everywhere. All these books, like these authors have resurfaced. Marie Redonnet became very popular a couple years ago. Her books came out in like the mid 90s from the University of Nebraska. Like there's that cycle has kind of come back around every so often. And so that particular grouping of authors, I think, is really exciting. But I don't know that France is exciting because I don't know that those kind of authors from France are being published right now. I looked back. I think I worked on 70 different French books over the course of my career.
Wow.
It might even be like 90.
Wow.
It's insane. Like there have been so many. And then there's been, for my whole life, I've been obsessed with like Argentina and Spain. So I always lean into like, there are amazing historical authors from Argentina in particular and Spain, but Argentina for sure. And that the more contemporary authors working in those two countries are some of them that I gravitate towards the most. They have that interesting mix of like kind of classical, not storytelling, but like story construction, world construction. And then something that's always like a little edgy. Like but they're not like so far experimental that you're like, this is incomprehensible. Like the post Nouveau Roman French writers, where it's like, no, I'm good. Like Nouveau Roman, good. You're going into an area that's too abstract for me. And so like these Spanish and Argentine authors kind of like toe that line where it's like leans into interesting structures, but yet has this grounding that I really respect and appeal to. But I think that what's happening now is that there's a real explosion of talent and like of attention being paid. So rather than having like a couple like areas of the world that define the aesthetic of like who's on top, so to speak, I think the thing is that everyone's finding someone from different corners. So a lot of like new voices are coming out of like the subcontinent, but South Asia, from like all the former French colonies, a lot of places that are getting like these kind of authors that shine and get a lot of attention at that moment, but their country may not be like the hot spot for that, but the authors are being found. So it's kind of being more diffuse than it was before. But if you look at like what's being translated, Spanish, French, German, always on top.
Yeah.
Always.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, out of every book that Open Letter has published, which is your favorite?
I will say Death in Spring.
Okay.
That book was one of the first ones we did. I had gone on a trip to Iceland and then to Catalonia. So from Reykjavik to Barcelona on one trip, which is truly boggling. And when I was there, I had no idea about Catalan culture. Not at all. Like nothing. Like I knew it existed as its own language, but I didn't know which authors were part of it, anything. I knew the Ramon Llull because that was who was bringing me there. He was a famous poet. That's what And so I got there and they're like, there's these two big authors. Mercè Rodoreda, who is a female writer from like the mid-century, died in like the 80s, is our like grandmother of all Catalan literature. And then Kim Manzo, who's writing contemporary, very funny, very like short stories primarily, sort of sarcastic black humor. And he had come up once before. Robert Coover had sent an email being like, you should know about Kim Manzo, but like nothing more than that, just like a rare mention. And so they talked about these. I met a bunch of publishers, very cool, all that stuff. Came home, read A Broken Mirror by Mercè Rodoreda. It was the one that was in the library. It was one of the like 3 that had been translated, and was like, this is one of the best books I've ever read.
Wow.
So we signed on Death in Spring, sight unseen, knew it was like her last book. that it was like a kind of a fabulistic, strange book that wove itself between like fairy tale and like these weird ritualistic experiences in a kind of true rural community. And we got it translated, and it is fantastic. It is everything you want from a book. It's got a modernist bent to it. It's got like postmodern imagery. It's funny at times. It's disturbing. It's absolutely just wonderful. And I would say that's probably our best book that we ever published. I believed in the most.
I was going to ask a question, but I think I just need to cut the interview short here so I can go home and start that.
Yeah, because you have a copy. I just ordered mine. Maybe we should do that for the next book club.
I was just going to say
and
that.
then we can have everybody buy all of your copies. We'll make an announcement before the end of the month. Everyone get their 40% off and move some books out of the warehouse for you. We'll bring it back to the number one spot.
Yeah, we'll influence it. So I kind of want to piggyback off one of the questions Tony just asking about, the current powerhouses in translated lit. Are there any languages that you think are underrated or that you think people should read more of? I mean, I feel like every time I go onto Instagram now, someone else has been reading Solenoid, which I don't mean that as a negative. I read it. It's a great book. But, because of that, Carter Rescue, and I'm sure Romania at large is starting to get a little bit more attention. Are there any other countries or languages that you think should get the spotlight?
One thing that's interesting is that I still prefer Demetrius Tsipaneag from Romania.
Yes, I have read A Novel to Read on the Train. You have my copy. That was a great book.
It's a fun book. The first one that we did, Baynard of the Fugue, that book is super fun.
I tried to order a copy of that recently, and I got an email that it's not in print. So,
yeah, I'll have to look. I have that on my list of people to like get their books back in print, which is a whole nother discussion, or get them restocked. And that one's going to be both easy and problematic. but I want to make sure all of his books are available. He was an author that meant a lot to Jon, and that structure of Baynard of the Fugue in particular is a huge like through line for Dalkey Archive. And to Open Letter, to like a slightly lesser extent, we don't have as many books that play around with the idea of repetition as like a movement. We have some, although I can't think of any. But Dalkey has a million. That's kind of like the one of the lines that you can pin, like you could hang like probably 50 books off of that are like classic Dalkey books that are about this kind of repetition movement, the nouveau roman, but mixed in with something that's like kind of more like meta aware. That's a very much a through line. And Baynard of the Fugue is an exact representation of that. And actually the book on Dalkey that I'm working on slowly but surely and setting up a bunch of interviews for right now, it includes parts of Jon O'Brien's novel, which is almost exactly in that same vein. It is Baynard of the Fugue. It is like retelling and changing, and the plot advances, the plot in quotation marks, very slowly through these kind of like repetitions, this fugue-like way of telling a story. And I really like that too. So it's kind of become like a central image for what the book I'm working on is going to be, and uses like what Jon was doing and all these representative texts from Dalkey that sort of flesh out like what the Dalkey aesthetic might be.
Very cool.
But Romania, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the book you're working for about Dalkey? I was very interested to ask about that as well.
So it's kind of
before you get into that, Chad, can you just give our listeners a little bit of backstory about what Dalkey Archive was and is now in modern day?
Yeah, Dalkey started in 84. It started in 81 as the Review of Contemporary Fiction, and then started publishing books that were specifically books that had gone out of print. There was like a change in tax law back when, whereby like dead inventory that you had in your warehouse wasn't taxed, and then it was taxed as like an asset. So a lot of presses put a lot of books out of print and just got rid of them if they weren't selling enough, because it wasn't worth paying for them, including them as like within the balance sheet. So a lot of things went out of print, especially things of a particular sort of aesthetic, right? That weren't like playing to the mainstream, that were doing something out of the ordinary. And Jon was interested in those books, interested in those authors, interested in like covering them both from like a academic, contextual way of framing them and reading their books. So he started doing all reprints of these books that had gone out of print by the authors who he was writing about and studying, and wanting to like bring to a larger audience. The press grows out of there and becomes a whole bunch of different things. Doing original books by American and British writers that are like towards the experimental end of things, doing more and more original translations, finding like different series, such as like the Korean Library, which was going to do 50, I think it did 35 books from Korean into English, which at that time, like, you know, there were probably 35 total works of fiction that were available. It's like, it was like all these different kind of modalities. And then Jon kept it going as long as he could. It was nonprofit, relied heavily on funding, like 60 to 70% of the budget would be through fundraising.
Wow.
All of that sort of falls apart for the world, and that's problematic. There's just not enough funding for literature at all, especially among individuals. And at a time where that's what could save everything, it would be the obvious way to make this work.
Right.
So Jon kept that going as long as he could through like various means of being connected with universities. He very much like burnt bridges, pissed people off. Everything would kind of fall apart for various reasons that were like his sort of like Achilles heel of like wanting to fight for certain things and dying on hills that you don't need to die on that had like bad repercussions, and losing employees. Like nobody was there very long. There's a whole sub story that I can't tell yet because I don't have all the details, but there are like certain nefarious actors at points in time. There's things that like could come out in the book that are much more salacious. But for the most part, what I'm writing about, and then Jon dies, there's a whole story of like how it gets kind of taken over by Deep Vellum, and I do the editorial, but that's, to be honest, not that interesting.
Sure. It's more just like honoring the name, I take it.
Well, that and like getting those books back into print.
Right.
So like Jon died with no files to print anything.
Oh my gosh.
No way to like reissue them. Nobody managing the inventory. Nobody doing any of like the back end stuff. So getting those books out there, reestablishing what the archive is and what Dalkey's like aesthetic, what its like available books are. It's a joy because there are books that 200 people have read and they could reach like 2,000.
Right.
But there is nothing there. There's no infrastructure. It's completely gutted. By like 2014, it's completely gutted.
Wow.
So the
something
book is
Tony and I
kind
talked
of
about last week or the week before. One of my favorite things to do when we go to a used bookstore is to just scan the shelves and look for Dalkey. Sometimes I will go into a bookstore and do only that. And like, if I think it's so cool to find, like you said, a book that maybe has only been read by 200 people tops. That's probably not in print anymore.
Yep.
And I have, I think I did I did some quick math when you shared that spreadsheet on Substack. I think I've got like 75, give or take. And now I'm just like, wow, I thought I had a lot.
Yeah.
No.
And there's 986 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whoa, no way. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so
doing
you're writing a book
series-
about Dalkey. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's sort of going to be a history. There's 2-3 things about it. One is that it's kind of a history of the press, at least in terms of found documents, stories I get from other people, and kind of like the interesting anecdotes. Like, how did Lost end up on Third Policeman? What was the story there? And in that case, it always kind of rolls over into like, what is the publishing situation in 1984, 1990, in 2000, and 2020, and how that kind of has evolved and what Dalkey's role has been within that. Because there's a big shift when in the 80s and 90s, when Dalkey's bringing back into print authors that have been forgotten. Say it's even like Stanley Elkin, who's someone I'm working on right now and getting his books all back and restocked right now by like the next couple months. And he was rediscovered by Dalkey in the late 90s, early 2000s, redid almost all of his books. Very funny writer, very much a writer's writer. Wonderful. At that point in time, there's not a billion books coming out. There's not even a billion like outlets. There's a certain number of bookstores that we're working with that are huge, that are hugely influential, that are making the big difference. And those books like come to exist, like these could survive for 100 years. We're going to find readership for them. they're important. Everything that Dalkey was doing within that larger pool, that pool wasn't that large, was very important. Nowadays, what does that mean? Like that if Dalkey's rediscovering a book amid like a moment where like 500,000 books are coming out, like where is that value? Like
Right.
that's one of the things I think is really interesting on like this explosion of like awareness of like being able to the bar to publishing is so low. Like anyone can get into it now in a way that you couldn't do it before. All the structures that bolstered and made Dalkey so critical and important have been altered. So like where is that value there? And then there's like a third kind of line that's like taking the both of those things and looking into like what the aesthetic of Dalkey is through individual books, through kind of these larger stories, and like how that plays off of like the books that were popular at the time. What's going on in like 1995 and what is Dalkey publishing in 1995, and how do these two things like run into each other?
And when can we expect this book to hit the shelves?
When am I going to get a sabbatical? Give me a sabbatical. I'm doing 4 jobs right now. This is my spare time.
Yeah.
My goal is to have like a real full draft of it by the end of next year. That includes like having to do a bunch of interviewing and research, and it kind of trucks along because it's spiral. Like it goes through like a bunch of all the different things from publishing, and then speeds up and speeds up and speeds up and speeds up as it like kind of paints this picture. So as it goes along, I think I'll just continue to like just crank out pages. But I need to do a lot of research. I need someone to send me to Stanford for 2 weeks so I can go through all the archives that are there, especially the correspondence with Gilbert Sorrentino, which is where the press really kind of got its origin. And I just need time to like not be doing 19 parts of publishing, just editing and writing and teaching. That's what I want.
Nice. Well, I'm certainly gonna pre-order a copy when it's available. Who's gonna publish it, do you think?
I don't have anyone interested yet. I'm writing this on my own. I'm going to put together, at the end of this month, I should be able to put together a true prospectus with like a 50-page, 100-page sample that I can send around to a few people. But I've been waiting to like really put together like the proper pitch with like a scope to it and like a good solid chunk of it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because on the Beyond the Zero podcast, one of the questions was, "Can you tell us some of the war stories from Dalkey?" And I kind of chuckled because I was like, I mean, what could there be for war stories? At a small independent press that does works in translation, and then like some of the stuff you said, I was like, oh, this is pretty serious. Like this is very interesting. Even if you had no idea about books, even if you weren't even a reader, I think you would think this stuff is interesting. So I certainly, I look forward to reading it and hearing more of those stories.
The job listing from hell.
Yeah, the job listing from hell was a funny one.
From hell. That's a whole chapter that I'm about to write. Like actually, that's the next one. That and the lost story. But there's so many because Jon's such a polarizing and interesting figure. Where in one light, and the book's going to vacillate between these two things as much as possible. In one light, he's like this quixotic, like good-hearted human who wants books to be available and finds this whole enterprise rewarding. And there's a very cynical view that he's adopted at times, that I adopt at times, that people can adopt at times, where it's like, what is the point of this? Like, we're struggling. We don't make any money. We're all like, doing 19 jobs and like grinding ourselves to dust for a future that's probably going to be more on TikTok than it is going to be reading. Like it's not like there's no indication that this is going to be a medium of the future that's going to be like growth based or like, a huge thing. It's like we have our readership by 20,000 people. We have our like baseline, things move up, things move down, but we're pretty like, it stays pretty even. Right. But he is quixotically like believes in this. And then at the same time has like extreme interpersonal issues, trust issues, paranoid issues. Like that could be accounted for as like a mental health issue or like any number of different reasons that you could do that. But the ramifications just keep piling on.
Right.
Like when you scream and yell at your main funder and you lose funding, then what happens? Then are these books going to come out? How does this work? You have this quixotic belief, like no practicality at times, like a way of like managing to like teach and train the next generation of all sorts of like editors and publishers that are out there, and at the same time alienate them so thoroughly that they
Right.
will not work for the one press they wanted to work for.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up like the TikTok thing and what's the point in the future. I don't know if you've ever heard me tell this story, and I've mentioned it before on our podcast, but when I initially made a YouTube channel, I was like, I kind of want to do book reviews, but I kind of want to do some other stuff. And I abandoned the book stuff because I was like, I don't know if I just don't think there's like going to be an audience for it, right?
Yeah.
And then Andy just kind of for fun started his Metafictional Meathead Instagram account, right? And I was like, okay, whatever. I don't even think I followed it initially.
No, it took you, I think, almost a year.
Yeah, and so
I think you followed me back and you were like, I forgot you were doing this.
Yeah, so he shared a post from his Metafictional Meathead Instagram to his like personal Instagram. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. I went and looked at it and I was like, wow, he has almost 1,000 followers. And at the time, I knew very little about Instagram. So I knew that he was reading some weird books. He was already a huge Thomas Pynchon fan at the time. And I knew that I could probably count on one hand the amount of people I know that even know who Pynchon is, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, wow, if Andy can get 1,000 people interested in following him for these books that like no one's ever heard of, I was like, maybe I was too quick to judge the potential audience. So that's actually when I really started doing more book content. And I really had an epiphany when I reviewed a book called The Bridget No Gun Re. It came out in 2001. It's a nonfiction. It was kind of a editorial collaboration between 3 different people. It's about a tragedy during the Korean War, very similar to the My Lai tragedy of Vietnam. And what had happened was the book got released 3 or 4 days before 9/11.
Yep.
And so 9/11 happens. Obviously, nobody cares about some book about the Korean War, which is already kind of a niche topic. The book totally tanks. They cancel the speaking tour that they were going to do for the book. And basically, that's it. Like, that's the whole story of the book, And I had come across it, read it, loved it, did a video about it on Instagram and TikTok. And I think on Instagram, it did like 200,000 views. And I was like, okay, there's something here where you can take a topic that pretty much nobody cares about, a book that nobody cares about, and make it cool and and people bought it. And then I was getting messages like I went to go buy it and I couldn't. It was like sold out because it was probably, they had the inventory that was just sitting around. It got cleared out because of the video. And then something similar happened with Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. Between TikTok and Instagram, just my videos on it did almost 2 million views. And
Jesus.
like, I know a lot of the online sellers, they have just like algorithmic pricing. So it's based on how many copies are kind of available. And like people were buying it, messaging me, oh, I got a copy. And then I started getting messages, I can't find a copy, or it's $75 on Amazon in my country. And so I was like, wow, like maybe it's a small impact, but I think if we all like do our part here, like maybe we can save reading,
Yeah.
And it's kind of maybe it's a grandiose dream.
Make reading cool again.
Like let's make reading cool again. And maybe it's a fool's errand, but like that's kind of what motivates me to keep going.
I think there's a collaboration aspect to it too. Like, Hard Rain was just re-released by New York Review Books, wasn't it?
It is released by them. I don't know when they published it though.
Yeah, it wasn't that recent.
Maybe I saw something that you guys did that made me think that they had just reissued it.
I would love to know what the actual sales impact is because Nick Perry, who does his handles Books Are Sick. I don't know if you follow him or seen him.
I think so.
He's a super great guy, and he's kind of like new to reading, I guess. Like his whole shtick is like, I'm not a big reader. I just kind of got into it in the last couple years, and he reads a lot of I guess more popular books, but not like super poppy. Like he is reading some great classics and stuff like that. And he saw my review of Hard Rain Falling. And he's like, yeah, I'm gonna go pick that up. And then he read it, and then he did a video about it, and that went bananas because he's got like 250,000 followers on TikTok or something. So I would love to know like what the sales numbers are when people like that make a piece of content.
I think I think a lot of us would love to know that. And they think there's the only way that you can get there is by truly sharing information. And I think my optimism sort of mirrors yours in that I think that there are these elements that are like making reading fun, bringing up these books, making them accessible, telling a lot of people about them at a point where like you are overwhelmed. Like even as a reader, I have like 20 books I brought with me for this one 6-week period I'm here in Wisconsin, and I don't know which one to choose. I'm always like, oh, maybe I should read this, maybe I should read that. There's always like so many options, and like I don't know what to pick from that. So highlighting things and making it sort of simple is a huge component. But I think that there's a collaboration issue. Like publishers tend not to share data, not to share successes. They'll lie about successes.
Sure.
Everyone exaggerates by like 300 to 400%. But like they'll talk about those. But like the real nitty gritty of it, of like how many of your books sell more than 1,000 copies? What percentage of them? What happens when? Yeah, what have you noticed when the New York Times does a book review? How many copies do you sell? It used to be like 4,000. Now it's like 400. Like all these things that you could sort of share together, even like stripping it and like making the data as anonymous as possible, being able to like explore that and figure out kind of what happens and how the ecosystem works. There's always surprises. Like we were talking about this on Instagram too, that there's like a certain amount that you can do on building an audience and getting a video that's like going to like expand the audience. And then there's that book that happens for, and it sells like 500 copies. And the exact same thing, exact number of viewership for a different book, and that book ends up selling 250,000 copies. And you just have that part of it, like what then happens next is like a little bit beyond us. And like every publisher bases things on aspirational goals. How many copies are you going to print of that? 5,000. Why? Because I want there to sell 5,000. I don't know, because I think that it deserves that.
If you build it, they will come kind of mentality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this isn't just me. There's a story of Morgan Entrekin from Grove that I know where he was giving a presentation on publishing, and a movie studio exec is like, well, how many copies do you print? Like, how do you do the test data? How do you get the market like numbers? And he's like, my gut. There isn't. He's like, well, how do you know? And he's like, aspirational. How many copies do I think we should sell? 20,000. We print 20,000.
Wild.
I love it.
That's a gunslinger's mentality right there.
But like we can't calculate it.
Yeah.
They like Ingram uses these comp sales that are like super fucked because they have to be from like publishers that are of your same size within the same distribution center, the same sort of book, not in content, but in like how much is going into advertising, what is it price, how big is it? All this stuff that like that's non-aspirational. That's like essentially like we're just replicating this data, so you will sell about the same as everything. Everything's like a heat death of book publishing.
Yeah, I think it's it can be hard to predict too, like when a piece of content is really going to go bananas or not. I think there's definitely some things you can do and some predictive markers that will give you an indication, but how far it will go is still a little bit dependent on the algorithm and a little bit of luck. I get messages at least a couple a week of authors, usually people that are self-publishing, trying to pay me to make a post about their book. And I'm like, I'm not comfortable doing it because for me, that's like my only credibility is I'm giving honest reviews of these books. I'm telling you really what I think of them. I would be 100% open to doing sponsored posts from publishers because there are certainly publishers that, you know, I believe in and want to see their books, you know, get more attention, but you can't give me $1,000 and for me to give you an honest review. It's tainted at that point. And I also think that you can't like fake your way to fame that way either. Like, I think when you give an honest review, that authenticity, whether the audience is conscious of it or not, or subconscious, they are picking up on if you're faking it or not. And I think that's a big part of content that does perform well because people are being authentic and giving like their true opinion on it. But yeah, that I would love to see like the back end data from like NYRB. Like, what did your Hard Rain Falling sales look like in the last 8 weeks? Is there a big blip on the radar? And I don't know if you're aware of this, but like Stoner by John Williams is a huge kind of darling on Instagram and TikTok. And I kind of tried to figure out like why that was. And so I looked at the Google Trends, which go back to 2001 or 2002.
Yeah.
And it got republished I think somebody picked it up and republished it in like 05 or
NYRB.
06. What's that?
NYRB did.
Yeah, and you can see a little bit of a blip there, and then it like falls off again. Yep. And then there's another big spike around like 2015 or 2016. And I'm pretty sure that's correlated with Books Are Better Than Food, the YouTube channel. What's his name? I forget.
Cliff.
He's got a maybe 200,000 subscriber YouTube channel. And he made a review of it right around that time. You see this big spike in Google Trends like going up, and then it kind of tapers off again, and then you see it kind of now it's a little bit more spiky in general, but I think it's just like the general zeitgeist of literature, social media. But it's I would love to see some of that back end data. So anyone from NYRB listening to this, please send me your sales numbers on Hard Rain Falling. Even if people said like it increased it by 10%, I don't need to know the actual volume, but like I'll just be curious the impact it has. I do want to start to wrap this up. Andy, do you have any more questions for Chad?
I have 3 more.
Oh boy.
Some of them we can kind of go rapid fire.
Oh boy. Okay, here we go.
Going back to what you were just talking about, aspirational goals for determining print runs and things like that. Are there any projects in the works, whether it's something that's confirmed, just kind of waiting for the books to come in, a final publication date, or stuff that's still kind of going on behind the scenes? I know you were messaging me the other day about those 2 Attila books. Is there anything that you're really excited about for the future of Open Letter?
Yeah, those 2, there's a lot of books, obviously. Like for the ones that are coming in the immediate future, Melville by Rodrigo Frazan, Muzzle Witches by Dubravka Greshik, her last final book that she wrote, Of Beasts and Fowls by Pilar Ardone, all amazing. The new Shen Sui book, our Latvian triptych, all these things, 100%. But in the books that are like kind of off in the future that are still being worked on, like the kind of like ones that haven't even been totally announced yet, the Attila books are fascinating because they are a book by an experimental writer that was a friend of Javier Marias's, who like wrote like Finnegan's Wake being the starting point. He was like born to a fairly wealthy family, studying medicine, but really was into writing like crazy ass shit. Carmen Balcells loved him as an agent, thought that he was the future of literature, and then never could get him the right publishing situation, the right moment to really break out. And so his final book, Attila, he wrote it and told various people, like, when I'm out of words, I'm done. And he finished that book and killed himself. He was like not doing great generally, but that was kind of his thing. He was dedicated to art. He was dedicated to this very difficult, very strange book, and wrote it and then died.
Wow.
And then we're publishing another book called Attila as well. So we're publishing that, Attila, being translated for the first time ever. I am one of probably like 40 people in the world who have now read it, like even Spanish or English. Like it's a really crazy book. Wow. Very difficult. And then Javier Serena, who wrote a book called Last Words on Earth, that's about a Bolaño figure, wrote about Alyosha Cole, this author of the Crazy Attila, and wrote about his like last years. And it's like a fictionalized telling of his like relationships falling apart, his dedication to this craft as like everything around him sort of crumbled, but he's dedicated to his art to the point that he dies. Those 2 books coming out at the same time on April Fool's Day next year is like a cool conceptual project that I think is really cool. And I think that Attila by Alyosha Cole is going to sell 10,000 copies? No. If there are 400 people that read that book and are like, this is interesting, even if I don't quite get it, that's more than enough. I believe that would be so good.
Well, you've got
But a
one
couple
buyer
months
right
after
here.
that, it's so good. I want you guys, and that's, no, both of those are Katie Whittemore translations. Have her on, have her just grill her on translation stuff and those books, and you'll be golden. The other one, though, is this book called VZ about Zelensky. It's by Dmitry Bykov, who's been living in exile. He lives in Rochester, New York, at the university where he teaches. But he was poisoned by the FSB. He's friends with like all the people who have been attacked by Putin. Everyone that's like on our right side of history. And he knows Zelensky well, interviewed him a bunch of times, interviewed everyone around him, and wrote this book that's a biography of Zelensky, kind of. It's a biography with like cultural kind of commentary and reflections and like other information that goes through like both his presidency, how he was, how he kind of changed politics forever, and everything. It goes up to the current day. Like when we finish editing this book, Bykov told me today that he has a final chapter that he's finishing, so it'll be as up to date as possible, called like The Last Chapter. And that book on Zelensky is amazingly interesting. Like it changes the way that I've looked at like world politics. It's fascinating for anyone who's into history, that's into like poli-sci, but into like kind of a cool story too. Because Zelensky is like an interesting figure who, jumps to fame as an actor, wins in this weird way, and then becomes incredibly unpopular.
Right. No, that
Until
sounds
there's a
right
war.
up my alley.
Yeah.
That's like that has a Tony. That's Tony written all over it.
All right, you got a book, books for Andy and books for Tony.
Do you think he would come on the podcast? Because I would. I would drive to Rochester to do an in-person interview for that, and we could do the four of us. What's that?
He's happy to do anything, and he's well known like to be like excessive. He writes like very long books. He writes new columns every day. He talks to everyone. He's just very gregarious and very like open to every.
We're going to Rochester, Andy.
Are any of his works available now through Open Letter or anywhere?
Not through us. There's one from, I think it's Blagoslav. No, it was from Alma Books. Alma Books published one of his novels 2012, some long time ago. And I don't think it's available in print, but it's out there.
Okay.
Cool.
Are there any books that you either missed out on or passed up that you regret passing or are upset that you missed?
Oh, God. Let me try and think. Well, one of the classic story is that we got, when I was at Dalkey, someone sent us a sample of The Savage Detectives by Bolaño before Bolaño was Bolaño. And I really liked it, and John really didn't. And so he just set it aside. And like 1 year later, everything starts coming out, and then explosion. So that one sucks to have missed out on. One of the funnier stories is I rejected The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and that went on to sell 1 billion copies. But I don't think it would have if we had done it. I'm just not a huge fan of that book. It's fine, but it's just not my thing entirely. But like if we had done it, it wouldn't have had that success. So, that's fine. Otherwise, I don't know. There's always, just as long as the books come out, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then my last question, a bit of a twist on one that Ben asked you. Tony asked you your favorite book that you've published at Open Letter. Give me your 5 to 10 desert island books amongst the ones that you've published, whether at Open Letter or Dalkey Archive.
Oh, God. Okay. So Museum of Eterna's novel, the first good novel about Macedonio Fernandez, that would be on that list for sure.
That's the one I just grabbed for you, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That book is great.
I was shopping the 40% off sale, and Andy had sent me the list of the books that he had gotten, and I came across that, and I was like, dude, I was surprised this wasn't on your list. It sounds right up your alley. And he's like, I didn't even see that one.
I just totally missed it.
So I ordered a copy so he could get his hands on it.
Oh, man. This is such a hard question. One of this counts but doesn't count is Bovard and Pécuchet by Robert. We did a retranslation of it by Mark Palazzati when I was at Dalkey. That book is wonderful for like a desert island book. As is, strangely, Thank You for Not Reading by Dubravka Greshik, which I did at Dalkey and at Open Letter. So that would be another good one. God, this is so hard. This I should have prepared for. in some way, shape, or form. I'm scanning through like all these lists of books to try and find something. What else is my favorite? Oh, Physics of Sorrow by Georgy Gospodinov. That definitely
Did you
is
end up
one of the
getting a
top
copy of
5.
that?
No,
I know I have it.
No, I somebody else has published that, right?
They Norton is now.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, the agent straight up lied to us about that.
Whoa, no way.
Yeah,
I
agents
wanted
are-
a copy of it, and they had a copy at our local indie store, Gibson's bookstore in Concord, New Hampshire, and it was the Norton version. I was like, I don't like the cover. I don't like the way the pages feel. So I was like, I'm just gonna get the open letter one.
Ooh, interesting. I don't know how many of those we have left, but then it's tough with the Dalkey books and books they publish because like Cigarettes by Harry Matthews is one of my favorite books of all time. But that came out before I was there, and then we recently reissued it through like this new program. So I feel like an affinity towards it. I did work on his book My Life in CIA, which is also spectacular, but I think Cigarettes is like truly a world like great work of literature. And if you go outside of books I've published, I think Life of User's Manual by George Prack for sure. That book is one of the greatest books ever written too. And if you haven't read that, that's worth it. And I don't know, I think it's available from Godin still, but it's really, really, really like the best.
Very cool.
But outside
That's
of
the
that,
one where it's like
those
just like a moment in time on that stairwell, right? Yeah.
in the house as a
Right.
whole, the apartment building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's cut up like a chessboard, and it uses the knight's move to move to 99 of the 100 squares that would be on the chessboard, touching on each part once, and you can like put that board on top of the drawing of a apartment building and cut apart where people's apartments are, and then see where each thing is, what's going on in that moment. But it also has like flashbacks, side stories, everything.
That's super creative.
Cool.
Yeah.
God, I don't know, man. Beyond that, I could just start naming a million books that I love, and I don't know that there would be 5 Desert Island books, or if they're just like, oh yeah, that book is amazing.
All right. So last question then. What if you could give one, I don't know if I want to call it a piece of advice, but if you could tell people one thing on how they can help, join the mission of making reading cool, keeping reading alive, keeping literature alive and works in translation alive, what's one behavior that you would love to see people take on as an individual?
I think it's kind of interesting. I think people should create more about the things that they read. So like what you're doing, paying attention to that, listening to the podcast, being involved in this world in some way, even if it's like you're not creating a podcast, but you're like listening to one, I count that as something. Like there's a real disconnect going on. Like we all used to have the water cooler TV shows, the water cooler books, the New York Times review, something on front cover. Everyone's talking about it, whether they like it or not, they're aware of it. That does create that kind of weird situation of the haves and have-nots. But in our world now, like engaging with stuff, if you're in this literary world, engaging within that literary world makes such a huge difference. And even if it's not a specific sales difference, there is like a huge value to like feeling good about what you're doing.
Yeah.
And when you do something, it just feels like it falls in a forest. It's heartbreaking. And then if you do find that people really did like it, how they got there is interesting, how they found that book. And like the more that we kind of connect ourselves and like work together across like any type of literature, whatever, the more that we're kind of like interwoven and supportive, the better off I think this will all work and won't feel so like isolating.
I love that answer because I've learned through doing the social media thing, how impactful it can be. And I told Andy early on, I said, I'm going to try to do this thing. And the worst comes to worst, I read a bunch of great books. Like if I get 0 followers, if nobody ever watches a damn video I make, at least I read a bunch of books. And I was already a reader, but I've certainly been more invested in the reading community since taking on this project. And there's accounts that have 100 followers that I've come across and like, I'd never heard of that book. That's cool. And I read it and I'm like, wow, I enjoyed that. So
that's been my takeaway from it too. I mean, I'm certainly less active as far as content creation as Tony is, but again, it's led me to a lot of great books. It's led me to a lot of great people, both readers and people within the industry, such as yourself, or being able to connect with authors.
It's just been a fun part, just community building experience.
Just being able to engage with other readers. Tony and I have talked about it on the air before, like in our personal lives here in New Hampshire and even outside, people we communicate with regularly. Like, we don't really have a lot of other people that are avid readers that we can have those water cooler moments to talk about this great book you read, or this book that's coming out that we're really excited about. So it's great to be able to hop on Instagram when I have my lunch break and be able to message with people about what we're reading, what excites us, things we didn't like, and just share information and engage with the community at large about books.
Even the podcast, right? I had this epiphany early on. I was like, wow, Andy and I sit down, we talk for 60 to 90 minutes with each other about books. It forces me, I shouldn't say force because it's a pleasure, but it encourages me to think more deeply about what I've read. Neither of us are really on our phones. I mean, we pull them up to maybe check some information here or there, but like in 2024, how often do people sit without the distraction of their phone and just have a conversation about one topic? It's so rare now that it's such a joy just to hang out with a friend and talk books with no distractions.
That's 100% why we do the 2-month review.
Yeah.
Is like 1 hour a week to talk about a specific book with one of my best friends, and like I don't see very often, but I see every week during that particular moment.
So if people want to buy Open Letter books or hear more from Chad W. Post, where can they go, and where can they find you? What's the best way to engage?
There's openletterbooks.org is where you can find all of our books and purchase them. And like you say, Women in Translation Month, all books written by or translated by women are 40% off. So that's a huge swath of our books. So almost everything's on sale. Then there's also the 2-month review podcast, which you can find at Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your stuff, and is live on YouTube every Thursday morning. If you want to like chime in, we used to have a lot of people during certain books that will like write comments and be like, "You're wrong." Like, there was one last week or the other week where they're like, "You're being pretty harsh to Kaya." And I was like, well, she's my wife. I can sort of like.
So that's Thursday mornings at what time?
It's at 10 a.m. Eastern.
Oh, I'm gonna start. I didn't know it was live. I'm gonna start. Calling in every
week.
week.
A very big risk. I have to like cut things every so often from that for the other podcast because I'll go a little too far. But then the last thing is, if you go to Substack, the Mining the Dalkey Archive Substack is where I'm doing most of my own writing right now, and that contains like business type stuff, excerpts or what will become excerpts from the book, and then also like analysis ? About certain Dalkey titles.
Very cool.
I don't think of myself as a literary critic. It's just like writing.
Very cool. Well, Chad, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the work that you do. If you're listening, go to openletter.org, purchase some books. Women in Translation Month, as he said, 40% off. The discount is automatically applied at checkout. And go support this great organization and this great art.
And buy some books that aren't on sale while you're there.
That's right.
I pre-ordered my copy of Melville, so I'm excited.
Oh, God, that book is so good.
I have not read any Frisson yet, so
you as a pension fan are in for a treat.
Yeah, I have the invented part is sitting on my shelf, just staring at me, like begging to be read. I think I gave Tony a copy as well.
So
that one is one of our best 2-month review seasons ever. Is covering that book.
Oh, so there's some back catalog of listening for that as well.
Wonderful.
Well, very cool. Thanks to everyone for listening, and you will see us next time.
All right. Bye-bye.